Hi everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me back. And if I saw you last year in Newcastle, hello again. Like Eric just said, my name's Matthew. I'm a Policy and Research Officer at the CIPP, the Chartered Institute of Payroll Professionals. I'm here today. I'm going to give you a little bit of a legislative update because, as Eric said and Dan said earlier today, it really underpins all the work that everyone at Cintra and the PSSG are doing, and in a lot of ways dictates what they're doing. So it's really key that we're aware of how it impacts you, how it impacts your employees, and how it impacts the wider payroll profession. So we're going to cover three areas: past, present, and future. We're going to have a quick look at what's just happened at the last payroll year end, but hopefully, fingers crossed, you're all fully aware of what just happened. We're going to have a look at what's currently happening with some consultations and a quick look at the current state of holiday pay and entitlement. It's a very key topic at the moment, a lot going on in that area that we all need to be aware of, making sure that we're always staying compliant there because there's a lot of room to slip up. Then let's have a look at the future, because to be a key strategic part of the businesses that you're in, payroll really needs to be looking at the future, seeing what's coming, so that you can inform those strategic decisions as they crop up and as you will need to be aware of them. So let's dive straight in with what do we know from the last year. So of course those tax and NI thresholds have been frozen, and we know that those are going to be frozen till 2028. And that's good for you to be able to plan for your workforce costs, but maybe not so good for employees who are hoping to have those personal allowances increased and pay less tax. Those NI rates are back down to the pre-health and social care levy amounts, so we have got last year's chaos of NI rates and thresholds out of the way, so hopefully we'll have a much smoother year with national insurance this year. The national minimum wage and national living wage rates have been uplifted, so those national living wage rates are now £10.42. I'm sure you all saw the news the other week of the naming and shaming list for those who fall foul of national minimum wage regulations. Make sure you don't end up on that, but for a lot of them, it isn't that they're not paying that £10.42, it's all those technical infringements, so do make sure that you keep up to date with all the rules around national living wage. The SSP rate is up to £10, definitely not, £109.40. Make sure you're not paying £10 per week. Those parental statutory rates are up to £172.48. A lot more on the statutory stuff later because some changes coming. P11 forms must now be submitted online. Hope you all know this because the deadline's today. I'll give it 2 seconds for anyone to go run out. And those student loan thresholds 1 and 4 have been uplifted. But all those rates do remain the same, so the percentage that's taken is the same. So I'm sure you're all aware of all these things, so that was a very quick run through. If you're not aware of any of those, I'm going to assume that your payroll software is so good that it does it all for you. So next, let's have a look at what's happening right now. And there's a lot of open and recently closed consultations. Now, if you don't know what a consultation is, it's where the government announces plans for legislative change that they want to implement, and they want your opinions, your views of those changes. So to give an example, the first one, simplifying and modernising HMRC's income tax services. In this consultation, they've proposed a lot of changes and asking for feedback of how to get people to interact with HMRC's online services rather than using the phone. I'm sure everyone has some horror stories about trying to contact HMRC on the phone, so if we can do a lot more self-service and a lot more two-way flows of information, that will be good. So the CIPP has responded to this consultation. If you are a CIPP member, you can see that consultation response on our website. The LPC, so the Low Pay Commission, also consults on the national living wage and the national minimum wage rates. So that's now closed for the 2024 rates. So they anticipate that the national living wage should be around that £10.90 amount, so about a 50p increase. Again, this is something that's good for you to sort of have a look at, dive into, because it could impact your workforce planning in terms of how much it's going to cost you for those lower paid staff. We also know that the national living wage is going to apply, or they're targeting it to apply to everyone 21 and over from 2024. So that's another planning aspect if you employ a lot of younger workers. The consultation also looked at what their plans should be going into the future. So for the past few years, their focus has been very much on this 2024 date to increase the national living wage scope. So where they go in the future, we don't know yet, so we'll await their response to this consultation. Off-payroll working, calculation of PAYE liabilities. If you employ a lot of off-payroll workers, if you do have to do a lot of IR35 status determinations, this could be very good for you to look into, looking at where a refund might be due to your company if the income tax has been paid by both the employee and the employer. Tougher consequences for the promoters of tax avoidance. So HMRC is very, very focused at the moment on targeting tax avoidance, specifically those who promote and perpetuate these different schemes. Now, I'm sure all of you are compliant, and that won't apply to any of you, but this is looking at bringing in tougher punishments, including criminal charges against anyone who continues to promote these tax avoidance schemes after they've been told to stop. Looking at the open ones now, so we've got one that's closing tomorrow, that's the retained EU employment laws reform. Now, the key changes in here are some small changes to 2P transfers, but the bigger scope here is that the Department of Business and Trade is looking at changes to holiday pay and entitlement. Namely, in this one, they're looking at the possibility of bringing back rolling up holiday pay. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about holiday pay after this slide, but it's very key that we don't get carried away and look at the future too much and focus on how things are happening now. But again, we will be responding to this one. Once that's online, you'll be able to view that in all its glory. Tax Administration Framework Review. So this is looking at potentially bringing in some legislative sandboxes. So as I'm sure Cintra are well aware, when you've got changes coming, you need people to test your products, test out how things work. And the same is true with the government. And historically, they've focused mainly on this consultation process, but that is very much dealing in hypotheticals. How could this work and how could this impact things, rather than actually knowing. So that's a good one to have a look at if you want to get involved in testing out future legislation changes and helping the government to shape future legislation. And again, like I said, very focused on non-compliance with tax avoidance. Here they're looking at non-compliance with umbrella companies. So there's a lot of issues with umbrella companies at the moment, not to say that all umbrella companies are an issue, but they have the scope within them to be vehicles for tax avoidance. So HMRC is really keen to see how they can cut that down without impacting those who are acting compliantly. Now, with consultations, these are all available on gov.uk to see and look through. The CIPP responds on behalf of our members and on behalf of the payroll community at large, but they are open for anyone to respond to. So periodically, have a look, see if there's any that would really impact you, and it's definitely your opportunity to get involved and shape future government legislation. Now, the current state of holiday pay. Harper versus Brazel. In the networking, I noticed a few people from educational institutes. You should be fully aware of this because this heavily impacts part-year workers such as those in the education sector. Now, this is a case of holiday pay and how that is calculated that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, I don't have too much time to go fully in depth, but if you need a better explanation, I will be available during the break times and we can definitely dive into it. But here's the key takeaways. So the Supreme Court said, "We therefore conclude that the Court of Appeal was correct to hold that the calendar week method represents the correct implementation of the working time regulations, and this is fully compliant with EU law." That means that those 12.07% calculation methods, rolling up, that sort of thing, may not achieve a compliant result. Now, I don't want to say they don't achieve a compliant result, because sometimes they do. However, the best way to achieve a compliant result is to use the methods that they're asking you to use to reach the correct outcome. Therefore, at the moment, as the law currently sits, that 12.07% calculation, we recommend that you don't use that. They also said a slight favouring of workers with a highly atypical working pattern is not so absurd as to justify the wholesale revision of the statutory scheme that the Harper Trust's alternative methods require. Bit of a mouthful, but what they're saying is that that holiday entitlement is not prorated down for a part-year worker who is on a permanent contract. That last bit, very important. Now, to try and illustrate this in its most absurd conclusion, and this is currently why they're consulting on changes to the holiday pay. Let's say someone works for 1 week a year and they earn £1,000. Well, you do your calendar method to calculate what their average week's pay looks like. You see that they've only worked 1 week at £1,000, so their average week is £1,000 per week. Now you pay them 5.6 weeks of holiday pay. That's £5,600 for someone who really did £1,000 worth of work for you. So this is sort of an absurd conclusion, and what the Supreme Court is saying is it's not so absurd and it doesn't happen that much, but the government do think it is a little bit absurd and are looking to make changes to that. What we're doing with our consultation responses is ensuring that it's equitable across everyone, and it makes sure that we're not incentivising people to take holiday or not take holiday, and make sure that it's fair across all types of workers, whether that's full-time, part-time, part-year, or irregular. So with the entitlement, as I just said, all workers must receive that 5.6 weeks. We've got the Regulation 13 and the Regulation 13A, and then on top of that, your contractual employment. And you can give this in weeks if the employer wishes to do so, and you can prorate that calculation as shown here. So, but what I want to really stress is that is the current state of holiday pay and entitlement. And we've got some consultations coming up and some consultations already concluded, but we just want to make sure that you're doing things right now. And then when things change, then you can change. Don't pre-anticipate those changes and do things incorrectly now. So we've got some changes coming to the flexible working request rules. So we are still currently awaiting primary and secondary legislation for this, but the changes have been announced that what they intend to do. So flexible working will become a day one right. Employees will be able to make 2 requests per year, and employees will then only have 2 months to respond rather than the current 3. Employees must then be consulted when a decision has been made or before that rejection is given. However, those rejection reasons have remained the same. So HMRC publishes a list of reasons you can give for rejection of a flexible working request. Those will be the same. Employees will also no longer need to provide the negative impacts of this request. That's for you to decide and you to feed back to the employee yourselves. Now, this is now a look into the future. This has not happened yet, but as I said before, anything you can do to plan and move forward and be a more strategic impact within your business is going to be a benefit to the whole business. And just because this is coming in the future, with a lot of these statutory schemes, they dictate a legal minimum level that you need to provide. There's nothing stopping you doing these things now because it is above and beyond that legal requirement. And just so you're aware, this applies to England, Scotland and Wales as employment law is devolved in Northern Ireland. I've been guilty of this a number of times of forgetting about Ireland, and as I saw earlier with Cintra Ireland, it's something that we need to be very hot on because Northern Ireland does have very different employment laws. Moving on now, so we've got a carer's leave coming up, and what this aims to do is allow a week of unpaid leave in order to provide or arrange long-term care for a dependent. It can be taken in half or full day increments and will be a day one right with no evidence requirements, and this is because it is unpaid leave. There's no evidence to do it, but you have a duty to provide that leave for these reasons. And those regulations are expected to be laid and commence in 2024. With parliamentary timescales, it's very difficult sometimes to give an exact date until they tell you. So This may come in from April, it may not, but that's my job to keep everyone informed with our CIPP news, so when that does get announced, we will let everyone know. And again, England, Scotland and Wales, employment law is devolved in Northern Ireland. Neonatal pay and leave is going to be a new type of statutory parental leave, and what this is for parents who have a child who enters into neonatal care, and this will be in addition to other leave, so in addition to paternity, in addition to maternity and adoption if applicable. Must be at least 1 week, and I believe it's up to 12 weeks. I've not put that on the slide, but I believe it's up to 12, where there's uninterrupted care, and that can be taken any time in 68 weeks after the child's birth. And what this is for is so that 12-week could be appended to the end of a maternity period as not to interrupt that maternity period. The entitlement to pay will be roughly aligned with the lower earnings limit as it is with SMP, SAP, SPP. But the leave itself will be another day one right with very little evidence needed for the leave, just providing information as to when that leave is going to be taken, but the pay will require additional information and additional evidence burdens. Implementation not expected until July 2024 because they said it would be 18 months after their initial announcement, and that would take us to July 24. However, it might be in time for the next tax year. We'll have to wait and see. And again, applies to England, Scotland and Wales, not Northern Ireland, unless they decide to adopt it. Now, paternity leave, there's some changes coming to paternity leave. Very hot off the press, this happened just last week. As you can see by not changing the slide picture, it's been shoehorned in last minute. So this was announced on the 29th of June, and the changes are that paternity leave will be allowed to be taken in 2 separate blocks of a week if needed, rather than meaning you have to take that whole 2 weeks at once. The leave can be taken at any point in a year following that child's birth, rather than just 8 weeks. And the notice requirements will be changed to be proportionate to the amount of time off. That last one's a little bit non-descriptive, so we'll have to wait and see as to what those different evidence requirements, or notice requirements, sorry, will be. But the first two, fairly self-explanatory and obviously a good thing for new parents. It will just need to be a little bit more planning on your part with resource that you'll need to take account of. Again, these changes will happen as legislative time will allow in Parliament, which is very up in the air. We can never give exact dates on these things. A little bit of an update on pensions. So those automatic enrolment thresholds have been frozen, remain the same as last year's rates. However, there are some changes on the horizon. There's a private member's bill currently going through Parliament, very slowly, I may add, that is seeking to extend auto-enrolment to everyone aged 18 and above. We're also looking to get rid of that lower qualifying earnings threshold, which would mean that every pound earned would then be pensionable. So this could be a huge impact to a lot of employers, huge impact to a lot of younger people in the workforce saving for retirement, and is quite a contentious subject at the moment, especially with the cost of living being something that none of us can avoid seeing in the news every single day. Whether people are saving for pension or being able to live at the moment is up for debate, but giving people the option and helping people save for retirement is definitely a key thing at the moment. Again, parliamentary timeline is unclear, and there is a potential that we could see future consultation on this, as it's not fully defined yet as to whether that's gone through that royal assent process. Now again, private pensions is devolved in Northern Ireland. However, in this area, they do tend to be very closely aligned and stick with the rest of the UK in this area. So it's usually anticipated that they would follow suit. Another thing that we need to plan for, company cars, so I'll just quickly run through this. So electric company car rates are limited to 1 percentage point increase per year from 2025 up to 2028, which would mean that they're going up to a maximum of 5% for electric cars and 21% for ultra-low emissions vehicles. For a long time, we didn't have this forward planning, so it's good now that we have this information and you're able to move forward, especially with something like company car leases, which has the potential to be a long-term vision for planning in your payroll departments. All of the vehicles will be increased by 1 percentage point in 2025-26, so that will bring them up to a maximum of 37% and then frozen for the 2 years after that. And finally, holiday pay and entitlement, the future. So as I said, there's a couple of consultations. One's finished, one's finishing tomorrow. That potentially is going to bring some huge changes to how we calculate and pay holiday. So there's the potential that we could have different processes for part-year and irregular hours workers. There's the potential that we allow rolled-up holiday pay, although the CIPP are suggesting that this maybe is just allowed for those part-year and irregular hours workers because it could cause some issues for full-time workers. And there could be additional data requirements. We know that the predominant method of processing payroll is on a monthly basis, but these holiday pay regulations, how we calculate pay and entitlement, very much hinge on what a week's pay is and when those weeks are worked. So, are your data capture processes up to snuff with these requirements? Do you need to collect extra data, such as hours worked per week, days worked, and what hours are worked on particular days? Because those could all be needed depending on what direction the government wants to go in following the consultations that they have put out. So, do you need to improve those? It's worth thinking about it now rather than panicking in the future when all the plans are announced. So, I just want to wrap up and say thank you very much. Add me on LinkedIn if you like. Subscribe to the Payroll Pages, which is our weekly newsletter that goes out on Friday on LinkedIn. If you do have any questions, I will be by the CIPP banner during the breaks. I've also got my colleague Dan with me here if you want to ask any questions about any of our other product offerings. So I will hand back over to Eric, and thank you very much.